Hello everyone, and apologies that I can't be with you in Dusseldorf tonight, but I'm just recovering from a medical procedure. Apologies also for the somewhat poor quality video, but I've gone for something that would transfer quickly and easily. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is goes under the title Reoccupying the Mainstream. Because this, I think, is what is necessary to happen to overcome what I've called Capitalist Realism. Capitalist Realism as the dominating logic, political logic of our times. So first of all, I'm going to say a little bit about what I understand Capitalist Realism to be. Then I'm going to talk about the changes in Capitalist Realism since 2008, and finally I'm going to turn to the title of this talk, Reoccupying the Mainstream, and suggest why an increased role in the so-called mainstream is necessary if we are to overcome what I've laid out, what I've described as Capitalist Realism. And first of all then, what is Capitalist Realism? Well, as I often say, Capitalist Realism is easier to identify than it is to define. Capitalist Realism is perhaps what Raymond Williams used to call a structure of feeling, something which defines a whole social field, but in its very ubiquitousness, in its very generality. That generality make it difficult to define. The temptation is to see it in terms of personalized or individualized feelings or attitudes, which is problematic, because in many ways, insofar as Capitalist Realism emerges as the level of individual psychology, this is an effect of a consequence of more transpersonal kind of ideological fields. So one way to get at Capitalist Realism is the belief that there is no alternative to capitalism. When the stress in that phrase, of course, lies on the particular sequence of words, there is no alternative, made famous by Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s. But the problem with conceiving of Capitalist Realism as a belief in this of this sort is that the very power of Capitalist Realism means that very few individuals are likely to experience this thought now. So it's not so much individuals who believe this. It's the kind of the big other of the ideological field that has this belief. It's a kind of background belief that is shared by the social system, that is a presupposition of the social system and the institutions in which we now live. Another way of getting to this would be that what we're confronted with then in Capitalist Realism is a kind of fatalism, a resignation, a sense that there's no real point in struggling against the dominant forms of capital. All we can do is adjust to them. And of course, when I'm talking about Capitalist Realism, what I'm really talking about is a pathology of the left, something which is to which the left has succumbed, and particularly the parliamentary left. And that's really what I'm mainly talking about today, or what I want to talk about today is the parliamentary left. Now, it's no accident that I wrote the book Capitalist Realism during the period of the Blair government in the UK. The Blair government is a kind of paradigm case of capitalist realism. What Tony Blair argued, what he really staked his whole reputation on, was the claim that what he characterised as old school socialism was finished, that it was urgent to modernise what he still would, at a certain point, I think, have called the left. But the reason I hesitated there is because ultimately, I think the Blairite project was not about modernising the left, but actually, as Jeremy Gilbert and I have recently argued in a pamphlet that was recently published by them, the group Compass in the UK, what Blairism was based on ultimately was the denial of the possibility of modernising the left. The term modernising became equated with the neoliberalisation. So rather than Blairism being about modernising the left, it became about the left adjusting to a so-called modernity dominated by the logic of neoliberalism. And Blair's strategy in respect of this, which is basically one of adjustment to this neoliberal domination, with the hope that maybe there could be a little bit of social justice alongside on the edges of a project which is fundamentally neoliberal. This kind of model of leftist acquiescence in neoliberalism, has provided a kind of template for the subjugation of left-wing parliamentary politics to neoliberalism. And subtending this then is a historical narrative, and it's partly a narrative, to touch on the themes of the symposium today, about the utopian, about the end of the utopian. That's part of the force, the power of the term realism, or the appeal to realism, is to be drawn from the fact that this realism is being contrasted with the supposed utopianism of any leftist project. What I'm suggesting is that the sort of the rise of capitalist realism is contingent upon really two moves. The first is to equate leftism with utopianism, and the second is to say that if there was ever a time for utopianism, if there's ever a moment when such utopianism seemed to be plausible, that moment has now passed. That moment is gone. We must now accept, adjust to, orient ourselves towards a reality in which not only is utopia no longer possible, but we can no longer convince ourselves that utopia is possible. But I think both of those moves are severely problematic. First of all, I think it's a mistake to associate the left with utopianism as such. Certainly the left ought to be, and plainly must be, about the construction of a better world than the one we live in. But to construe that as necessarily or exclusively utopian is already to invite a certain kind of defeat, I think. secondly, and as I've already indicated, and as Jeremy Gilbert and I argue in that pamphlet pamphlet called Reclaim Modernity that I just mentioned, it's essential that the left refuse this idea of obsolescence, refuse the idea that its moment has passed, refuse this whole kind of historical narrative, which means that neoliberalism can lay claim to the present and therefore to the future, and to any possible future. In other words, what's at issue is not then discredited leftist utopianism versus capitalist realism, but an alternative realism. What we have to recognise is the extent to which capitalist realism, like any political realism, was an achievement. What now seems to us realistic, inevitable, the only possible set of political parameters was of course imposed by a kind of quasi-Leninist political project, and that's been described by many people, including David Harvey. Neoliberalism, was imposed from above. It, at one point, when social democracy was in its pomp, neoliberalism and its key tenets would have seemed utterly ludicrous. Now, and completely implausible. Now, the situation is reversed. Now, social democracy itself has been made to seem a somewhat utopian project, scarcely imaginable anymore, and certainly difficult to imagine anything of that sort being implemented in the current moment. But that's itself, and that's achievement of capitalist realism. That's an achievement of the project. So, what counts as realistic is always a political question, and this seems to me, if we want to combat capitalist realism, then we need to be able to articulate, to project an alternative realism. We might have thought that since 2008 things would have come our way a bit, but that clearly has not happened, or not in any major way. The events of 2008 and what led up to them ought to have constituted the most systematic discrediting of an ideology in history, and I use the term discredited deliberately. However, even if neoliberalism has been systematically discredited, this hasn't done any damage to it, and that's perhaps not surprising. We're now in an era where the ruling political ideas don't need legitimacy in many ways, and neoliberalism doesn't require active assent. Why? Because it has been so successful in taking control of all the institutional defaults of the societies in which it has taken hold. It's been so successful in seizing those institutions that it remains because it has the defaults, it remains the default option. Unless another political agent can come in and seize those institutions, can switch the defaults, to a new set of norms, to a new set of institutional kind of pragmatics, then clearly things can remain the same. Neoliberalism doesn't require cheerleaders, doesn't require people to actively support it. In many ways, I think it never had that active support. What neoliberalism was successful in doing was not necessarily in persuading people that it had the best ideas, but it was successful in persuading people that it had the ideas that would win. This is what capitalist realism is, really, the idea that neoliberalism is going to win whether we like it or not, and it's a question of how we adjust ourselves to that. And so in many ways what we've seen since 2008 is an intensification of capitalist realism with the implementation of austerity programs which can only really work if we accept the basic tenets of capitalist realism. The idea that the only viable political economic system is capitalism, and the only plausible political economic project is that of neoliberalism. So austerity is based on saving neoliberalism, and the idea that's still in all of our best interests, and really that there is no alternative to this. Now, what we've seen really since the 90s, and perhaps even since the 60s, is the tendency for the left to be associated with marginality and opposition. Perhaps the emergence of the term anti-capitalism is itself symptomatic of this. You might say, well, what's wrong with that? Shouldn't the left be about overturning the current dominant conditions? Yes, of course, it should be about that. But shouldn't it also be about a vision of managing and controlling society better than it is now being managed and controlled? I think part of the issue here is that neoliberalism has colonized the concept of management, as if any version of management is neoliberal. But there's no inherent connection between the concept of management and neoliberalism or capitalism. In fact, we could argue management, the proper management of society, the rational management of society, has always been an aim of the left, or a goal of the left. So what we've had since 2008, a kind of sporadic, or at least in the West, sort of sporadic displays of anti-capitalism. These have tended to take place, if we treat the Occupy movement as kind of paradigmatic, outside, self-consciously outside the mainstream, outside the sort of the parliament and the mainstream media. But actually, I think one of the key contributions of something like Occupy was its precisely its meme, the meme of the 1% versus 99%, something which was generated, was propagated through media. I think it's by now clear that, particularly at a time of rising right-wing populism, that the right have no qualms about being in the mainstream, and that if we concede the mainstream to the right, if we continue to concede the mainstream to the right, and that we remain outside, if we look at the geography of protest, the identification of ourselves with kind of street protest, instead of having the ambition to be inside the institutions and controlling society from there, if we continue to be on the streets protesting then it's pretty obvious that it's pretty clear by now that capital can just wait out protests, walk by them. They don't cause enough disruption to give capital any pause, which isn't to say there's no value in the movements that generate those protests, but if those movements are not articulated, if they're not connected up to the traditional forms of power, media power and political power, then then what we could call the means of reality production, the place where social reality is, the zones where social reality is produced and reproduced, will still belong to the enemy. I think we need then to move away from anti-capitalism as a model and start to move towards thinking again about a positive political project, to control and manage society in a better way. And that involves connecting up, coordinating all of the different, or many of the different groups on the left, with a view to seizing the means of reality production back, constructing a new reality, a new realism that will be a break from the depressing 30-year reign of capitalist realism. Okay, I'll leave it there for now, and I hope to be able to answer some of the questions via Skype. Okay, thank you very much. Bye.